Every legend has a hidden story, a moment that changed everything. For Michael Jordan, that moment wasn't when he hit the winning shot in the 1998 NBA Finals. It wasn't even when he became the greatest basketball player in history. It was when he failed, and when one person saw past that failure. Game 6 of the 1998 NBA Finals. The Delta Center in Utah. Michael Jordan steps onto the court for what might be his final game. The crowd is deafening. The pressure is immense. Everything is familiar, until he sees her. There, in section 1 to 13, row 22, sits the woman who changed his life 20 years ago. The teacher who found him crying in her classroom after being cut from the varsity team. The person who taught him that sometimes the biggest failures lead to the greatest victories. Mrs. Thompson, his geometry teacher, and she's holding something in her hands. Something she gave him on graduation day. Something he never opened. What happens next will make you believe in the power of a teacher who saw greatness in a kid who couldn't make his high school basketball team. The lights in the Delta Center were brighter than usual tonight. At least, that's how they felt to Michael Jordan as he adjusted the laces on his red and black Air Jordans. Game 6 of the 1998 NBA Finals. Bulls versus Jazz. One more win, and they'd have their 6th championship. Michael had been in countless big games before, but something felt different about this one. Maybe it was because everyone kept saying it might be his last game ever. Maybe it was the way the Utah crowd was louder than any crowd he'd ever heard. Or maybe it was because of that strange feeling he couldn't shake. The feeling of being watched. Sure, he was always being watched. That's what happened when you were Michael Jordan. But this was different. This felt personal. Like someone was looking right through him, seeing past the jersey and the fame to the person he used to be. As he went through his warm-up routine, muscle memory took over. Dribble, crossover, jump shot. Dribble, spin move, fade away. Each movement was perfect, practiced a million times. The ball arced through the air exactly the way it was supposed to, the way he'd learned it should, the way she had taught him it would. That's when he felt it again, that sensation of being watched. He turned toward section 113, and his heart skipped a beat. For a split second, time stood still. The rowdy crowd, the bright lights, even the squeaking of sneakers on the hardwood. It all faded away. There, in row 22, sat a face he hadn't seen in 20 years. A face that brought him right back to room 234 of Emsley A. Laney High School. "Yo, MJ!" Scottie Pippen's voice snapped him back to reality. "You good?" Michael nodded, but his mind was racing. It couldn't be her. Could it? After all these years? He tried to look again, but the sea of faces had blurred together. "Just got lost in thought for a minute," he said, forcing a smile. But his hands were shaking slightly as he wiped them on his shorts. Phil Jackson gathered the team for their final pre-game huddle. Michael tried to focus on his coach's words, but his eyes kept drifting back to section 113. The game plan, their defensive strategy, the plays they'd run. It all seemed distant now. All he could think about was that face, those kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the way she used to say, "Mathematics, Mr. Jordan, is everywhere, even in basketball." The buzzer sounded. It was game time. As he took his position on the court, Michael felt unusually nervous. His palms were sweaty, his heart racing faster than normal. This wasn't like him. He was Michael Jordan. He didn't get nervous. He made other people nervous. The referee tossed up the ball for the opening tip. Time to push everything else aside. Time to be the Michael Jordan everyone expected him to be. First possession. The ball came to him at the top of the key. He'd made this shot 1,000 times. But as he released the ball, something felt off. The angle wasn't quite right. Clang! The ball bounced off the rim. "Shake it off," he muttered to himself. But his next shot missed too. And the one after that. 3 missed shots in a row. The crowd was getting louder. He could hear the whispers starting. What was wrong with Jordan? Tonight, during a break in play, he couldn't help himself. He looked back at section 113, row 22. This time, he was sure. The gray hair was different, and 20 years had left their mark. But those eyes that had seen something in him when he was just a frustrated sophomore who'd been cut from the varsity team, they were exactly the same. It was her, Mrs. Thompson, his geometry teacher, the woman who had changed everything. And suddenly, he was no longer in the Delta Center in Utah. He was back in that high school hallway, holding a piece of paper that had crushed his dreams, fighting back tears as he heard the varsity coach's words echo in his head. "You're just not ready, Michael." He hadn't known it then, but that moment of failure would lead him to room 234, where Mrs. Thompson was about to teach him something far more important than geometry. The referee's whistle brought him back to the present. As he got into position to defend against John Stockton, his mind was spinning with questions. Why was she here? Why now? And why did seeing her make him feel like that sophomore kid all over again? The game clock was running, but in Michael's mind, time was bending backward, taking him to where this story really began. To a day when a geometry teacher saw something in a broken-hearted kid that nobody else could see. Karl Malone was coming down the court with the ball, but Michael barely noticed. All he could think about was the last thing Mrs. Thompson had ever said to him. "Sometimes, Mr. Jordan, the most important angles in life aren't the ones you can measure with a protractor." He hadn't understood what she meant back then. He was about to find out. The crowd roared as he missed his 4th shot in a row. For the first time in his career, Michael Jordan was afraid. Not of losing the game, but of disappointing the one person who had believed in him before he was Michael Jordan. As Phil Jackson called a timeout, Michael glanced once more at section 113. Mrs. Thompson was watching him with that same patient smile she'd worn 20 years ago, when she'd found him crying in her classroom after getting cut from the team. That day had changed his life forever. And somehow, Michael knew this game was about to change it again. As Michael walked toward the Bulls' bench, the noise of the Delta Center faded away. His mind drifted back to that autumn afternoon in 1978, the day everything changed. He could still smell the fresh floor wax in the hallway of Laney High, could still feel the roughness of that single piece of paper in his trembling hands. The varsity roster, the one his name wasn't on, Michael Jordan. Sophomore. Height, 5'10". Position, guard. Status, cut. He'd read those words at least 20 times, hoping they'd somehow change. They didn't. His fingers had crumpled the paper's edges as he stood there, trying to hold back tears that wouldn't listen. The worst part wasn't getting cut. The worst part was knowing his older brother Larry had made varsity last year. Larry, who was already 6'2". Larry, who everyone said was the real athlete in the family. "Hey, at least you tried," some kid had said, patting his shoulder as he walked past. Michael had wanted to disappear. The hallway was emptying out. Basketball tryouts were over, and most kids were heading home. But Michael couldn't go home. Not yet. Not like this. Without thinking, he'd found himself walking toward room 234. The door was open, like always. Mrs. Thompson was at her desk, grading papers with her red pen. She didn't look up right away, but Michael knew she'd heard him come in. She always seemed to know when someone needed her. Mr. Jordan, she'd said finally, looking up over her wire-rimmed glasses. I didn't expect to see you this afternoon. I thought basketball tryouts were today? That's when the first tear had fallen. He tried to wipe it away quickly, but Mrs. Thompson saw everything. She always did. Close the door, she'd said gently, putting down her red pen. Michael had done as she asked, then stood there awkwardly, still clutching the crumpled roster in his hand. Mrs. Thompson didn't say anything. She just waited, giving him time to find his voice. I didn't make it, he'd finally managed to say. Ah, she'd replied, as if he'd just solved one of her geometry problems. And you think this is the end of your story? The question had caught him off guard. He'd expected sympathy, maybe even pity. But Mrs. Thompson never gave you what you expected. That's what made her different from other teachers. Coach said, I'm not tall enough, Michael had continued, his voice cracking. Said I'm not ready for varsity. Mrs. Thompson had stood up then, walking to the chalkboard where geometric shapes were still drawn from that day's lesson. She'd picked up a piece of chalk and drawn a perfect circle. Tell me, Mr. Jordan, what do you see? Michael had stared at the circle, confused. It's just a circle. Is it? She'd drawn a line through the center. Now what do you see? A circle cut in half? Exactly. She'd turned to face him, chalk dust on her fingers. But notice something, Mr. Jordan. Even though I cut this circle, it's still a circle. The cut didn't destroy it. It just gave us a new way to look at it. She'd walked over to where he stood, gently taking the crumpled roster from his hands and smoothing it out on her desk. Sometimes in life, Mr. Jordan, we focus so much on what we think should happen, we miss what could happen instead. She'd opened her desk drawer and pulled out something that made Michael's eyes widen, a basketball. Did you know that basketball is all about geometry? She'd bounced the ball once, catching it smoothly. Every shot you take creates an arc. Every move you make forms an angle. Even the court itself is one big geometric puzzle. Michael had wiped his eyes, intrigued despite his sadness. What do you mean? Come early tomorrow morning, she'd said, putting the ball away. 6 a.m. before anyone else gets here. I'll show you. But tomorrow's Saturday. Yes, it is. She'd smiled that knowing smile of hers. And you have a choice to make, Mr. Jordan. You can let this cut define you, or you can let it refine you. Which will it be? Before he could answer, she'd added something else. Sometimes our biggest failures lead to our greatest victories. Jordan. Phil Jackson's voice cut through the memory, yanking Michael back to 1998. You ready to go back in? Michael looked up at his coach, then back at section 113. Mrs. Thompson was still there, watching. Just like she had been every morning at 6 a.m. for the next 2 years. What no one knew, what he'd never told anyone, was that those early morning sessions hadn't just been about basketball. They'd been about something much bigger. Something he was only now beginning to fully understand. Yeah, Coach, he said, standing up. I'm ready. As he walked back onto the court, Michael felt something shift inside him. The nervous energy was gone, replaced by a familiar feeling, the same one he'd had 20 years ago, walking into room 234 at exactly 6 a.m. the morning after being cut. He looked up at the scoreboard. Bulls were down by 12. His shot wasn't falling. The Jazz crowd was going crazy, but none of that mattered now, because Michael Jordan had a secret weapon in the stands, the same weapon he'd had 20 years ago when a geometry teacher had shown him that sometimes the best way to overcome an obstacle wasn't to go through it, but to find a completely different angle. As he got into position, he heard Mrs. Thompson's voice in his head. clear as if she were standing right beside him. Remember, Mr. Jordan, it's all about the angles. Dari Chiwon's ball came his way. Michael smiled. It was time to show the world what a geometry teacher had taught him about the art of the perfect shot. The next morning, after being cut, Michael had shown up at room 234 at exactly 5:55 a.m. He'd found Mrs. Thompson already there, the basketball from yesterday sitting on her desk next to a stack of graph paper and several protractors. "Good morning, Mr. Jordan," she'd said, without looking up from what she was writing. "Punctuality. That's the first lesson." The school gym was still locked at that hour, so Mrs. Thompson had led him to the outdoor court behind the school. The biddy morning air was crisp, and their breath made little clouds in the dawn light. "Before you touch this ball," she'd said, holding up the basketball, "I want you to do something for me." She handed him a piece of graph paper and a pencil. "Draw the court. Every line, every angle, every dimension." Michael had stared at her in confusion. "But I thought we were going to practice shooting." "We are." That knowing smile again. "But first, you need to understand your workspace. You're in my geometry class, Mr. Jordan. Everything we do here will have a purpose. Trust the process." So he'd drawn the court, measuring and marking every line. When he'd finished, Mrs. Thompson had taken out a red pen, the same one she used to grade papers, and started marking his drawing. "The free throw line is 15 feet from the backboard," she'd said. "The three-point line is 23 feet, 9 inches. The key is 16 feet wide." She'd looked up at him. "Numbers don't lie, Mr. Jordan. They tell us exactly where we stand." That first morning, they never touched the basketball. Instead, Mrs. Thompson had him calculate angles. How many degrees was the corner of the key? What was the angle of a shot taken from the wing? From the top of the key? As the sun rose higher, Michael had grown frustrated. "Mrs. Thompson, how is this going to help me make the team?" She'd adjusted her glasses and pointed to his drawing. "Tell me, what's the shortest distance between any 2 points?" "A straight line," he'd answered automatically. It was one of the first things they'd learned in geometry class. "Exactly. But in basketball, can you always take the straight line path to the basket?" Michael had thought about the defenders who'd blocked his shots during tryouts. "No. So what do you do instead?" "You find another way around?" "You find another angle?" she'd corrected. "And that, Mr. Jordan, is what we're going to master." Back in the present, 1998, Michael dribbled the ball at the top of the key. Karl Malone was guarding him, but Michael wasn't seeing Malone anymore. He was seeing the angles, just like Mrs. Thompson had taught him. The play clock was winding down. His teammates were getting into position, but Michael stayed still, calculating. The basket was 10 feet high. He was 20 feet out. Malone was 6'9", 37 degrees, he whispered to himself, remembering Mrs. Thompson's voice. The perfect arc. Those early morning sessions had continued through his sophomore year. Each day added a new layer to what Mrs. Thompson called the geometry of greatness. She'd taught him about parabolas by having him shoot hundreds of free throws, tracking the arc of each one. She'd explained velocity using bounce passes and force vectors using chest passes. Every basketball move had its mathematical twin. "Setimi, numbers don't lie," she'd say after each session, showing him the calculations. "Look at your improvement. It's right here in the data." And she'd been right. His shooting percentage had improved week after week. His passes had become more accurate. Even his dribbling had gotten better once he understood the angles of the ball's bounce. Now, 20 years later, Michael faked left, watching Malone's center of gravity shift exactly as he knew it would. The defender's weight was at a 45-degree angle, too steep to recover quickly. Michael smiled. Mrs. Thompson had taught him that too. Your body can only move as fast as physics allows, she'd explained one morning, drawing force diagrams on the outdoor court with chalk. Once someone leans past 45 degrees, they need at least half a second to recover. That's your window. Spun right, just as he had practiced thousands of times on that outdoor court. But this time, something was different. This time, he could almost see the geometric patterns Mrs. Thompson had drawn, glowing on the hardwood like neon lines. The dotted other players became points on a graph. The court transformed into a coordinate plane. And the basket? It was just the end point of a perfect parabola, waiting to be drawn. But as he rose for the shot, his eyes caught Mrs. Thompson in the stands again. She was holding something in her hands, something that made his heart skip a beat. It was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, folded into precise triangles. The same paper she'd handed him on graduation day, the one he'd never opened. Sometimes, she'd said that day, the most valuable lessons take years to understand. The ball left his hands at exactly 37 degrees. As it arced through the air, time seemed to slow down. In that moment, Michael finally understood what Mrs. Thompson had been teaching him all along. It wasn't just about basketball. It wasn't even about geometry. It was about something much bigger. The ball reached the apex of its arc, and Michael knew, with mathematical certainty, what was about to happen. After all, numbers don't lie. The ball swished through the net. Perfect. Just like Mrs. Thompson had predicted it would be 20 years ago. The crowd's roar brought Michael back to the present moment, but his mind was already racing back to another prediction she had made. Back to the day she'd first shown him what would become his signature move. It had been 3 months into their morning sessions. Winter had set in, and the outdoor court was too icy to use. But Mrs. Thompson had come prepared. She'd somehow convinced the janitor to give her a key to the gym. Today, she'd said, unlocking the heavy doors, we're going to create something new. The empty gym had smelled of floor polish and possibility. Their footsteps had echoed as they walked to center court, where Mrs. Thompson had laid out her usual tools, graph paper, protractor, and a red pen. Mr. Jordan, she'd said, what would you say is your biggest weakness on the court? Michael had thought about it. The bigger players can block my shots. Exactly. She'd smiled that special smile of hers, the one that meant she was about to change everything. So, let's solve that problem. Not with more power, but with mathematics. She'd taken out a fresh sheet of graph paper and drawn a diagram he'd never forget. What if, she'd said, drawing lines and angles, you could create a shot that was almost impossible to block? A shot that used the defender's height against them? Young Michael had leaned in, intrigued. How? By changing the angle of attack. She demonstrated with a pencil. Instead of shooting straight up, you lean back slightly. The defender's momentum carries them forward, while you create space by moving backward. Michael had frowned. But wouldn't that throw off the shot? Only, if you don't calculate the correct angle of release. She'd made more marks on the paper. We need to account for the backward momentum, the release point, and the arc of the ball. It's a complex equation, but once you solve it, she'd handed him the ball. Try it. Push off your back foot at a 45-degree angle. Lean back to create a 70-degree angle with the floor, and release the ball when your arm forms a 110-degree angle. It had felt weird at first, unnatural. He'd missed the first 20 shots badly. Keep going, she'd encouraged. Feel the mathematics. By the 100th attempt, something had clicked. The ball had arced perfectly, dropping through the net with barely a ripple. "That," Mrs. Thompson had said proudly, "is your fadeaway." Back in the present, Michael watched as John Stockton brought the ball up the court. The Jazz were still leading, but the gap was closing. His made shot had brought them within 7 points. In the stands, Mrs. Thompson was writing something in a small notebook, just like she used to do during their morning sessions. Every shot, every move, every success and failure carefully documented. "Promise me something," she'd said one morning after he'd finally mastered the fadeaway. "Promise me you'll remember that everything in life has an equation. Every problem has a solution. You just have to find the right angle to approach it from." Young Michael had promised. But there had been another promise too. One he'd made to Sudu himself the day she'd missed their morning session for the first time. He'd arrived at 5:55 a.m. as usual, but the gym was locked. Mrs. Thompson wasn't there. She'd never been late before. When he'd finally seen her later that day in geometry class, something was different. Her face was paler, her hands slightly shaky as she wrote on the chalkboard. "Just a doctor's appointment," she'd said when he'd asked. But her smile hadn't quite reached her eyes. That afternoon, he'd overheard 2 teachers talking in the hallway. They'd mentioned Mrs. Thompson's name, followed by a word that had made his blood run cold: cancer. The next morning, he'd arrived at the gym at 5:30 a.m., determined to show her how much their sessions meant. He'd practiced the fadeaway over and over, each shot more perfect than the last. When she'd arrived at 5:55, her eyes had been red, but her voice was steady. "Show me," she'd said. He'd performed the fadeaway exactly as she'd taught him. Perfect angle, perfect arc, perfect splash through the net. She'd written something in her notebook, then torn out the page and folded it carefully into triangles. "One day," she'd said, holding the folded paper. "This shot will mean more than just 2 points in a game, but you're not ready for this yet." Now, 20 years later, Michael watched as she held up that same piece of paper in the stands, the one she'd given him at graduation, the one he'd never opened. Stockton passed the ball to Malone. Michael got into his defensive stance, but his mind was racing. What was written on that paper? Why had she kept it all these years? As he moved to steal the ball, he remembered the last thing she'd said during that morning session. "Sometimes, Mr. Jordan, a promise isn't just about what you say you'll do. It's about who you become while keeping it." The ball came loose. Michael snatched it and headed down court. The crowd was deafening, but he could still somehow hear Mrs. Thompson's voice in his head, teaching him about angles, about physics, about life. 3 Jazz defenders stood between him and the basket. The shot clock was winding down. His teammates were covered. Michael smiled. He knew exactly what to do. After all, he had a promise to keep. Time seemed to slow down as Michael surveyed the court. 3 defenders, 5 seconds on the shot clock, and what felt like the weight of the world on his shoulders. But in his mind, he was back in that high school gym, with Mrs. Thompson's voice guiding his every move. When multiple defenders are in your path, she'd taught him, think of them as intersecting lines on a coordinate plane. There's always a path through the intersections. You just have to find it. The first defender came at him from the left. Michael crossed over, his hand switching the ball at a precise 45-degree angle, just like he'd practiced thousands of times on graph paper before ever trying it on the court. "Basketball is poetry written in numbers," Mrs. Thompson had said one morning, watching him practice this very move. "Each step is a word, each play a verse, and the game itself is your story. The second defender rushed to cut him off. Without hesitation, Michael spun right, using the momentum he'd learned to calculate all those years ago. His body remembered every equation, every angle, every mathematical truth that Mrs. Thompson had drilled into him. But as he approached the third defender, something strange happened. The numbers and angles that usually filled his mind disappeared, replaced by a memory he'd tried to forget. It was the day after he'd made JV team captain. He'd arrived at the gym early, eager to show Mrs. Thompson his new jersey. But instead of their usual morning session, he'd found a substitute teacher in her classroom. Mrs. Thompson is taking some time off, the principal had told him later, that day. For treatment. Treatment. That sterile word that meant something was terribly wrong. For 2 weeks, he'd shown up at 5:55 a.m. anyway, practicing alone, solving geometry problems between shots. Then, one morning, she was back. Thinner, paler, but her eyes still blazed with that same determination. "Did you keep up with your calculations?" she'd asked, as if she'd never been gone. He'd shown her his notebook, filled with equations and shot trajectories he'd worked out himself. She'd smiled that proud smile of hers, but there had been tears in her eyes. "You don't need me anymore, do you, Mr. Jordan?" "That's not true," he'd protested. "I'll always need you." She'd taken out her red pen then, the same one she'd used to grade his first geometry test, and written something in her notebook. That same piece of paper she was holding in the stands right now. Now, facing the final defender in the present, Michael understood something he hadn't back then. Mrs. Thompson hadn't just been teaching him basketball, she'd been teaching him how to learn, how to solve problems, how to face challenges that seemed impossible. The shot clock showed 2 seconds. The final defender, Brian Russell, was perfectly positioned. There was no clear path to the basket, no obvious angle of attack. Or was there? Michael heard Mrs. Thompson's voice as clearly as if she were standing next to him. "When there's no clear solution, Mr. Jordan, change your perspective. Step back. Look at the problem from a different angle." His body moved before his mind could catch up. The crossover, dribble, the slight push, the step back. Each movement was a line in Mrs. Thompson's geometry, forming a shape that would become legendary. As he rose for the shot, time truly stopped. He could see Mrs. Thompson in the stands, holding that folded paper, and suddenly he knew what was written on it. Somehow, impossibly, he knew. The ball left his hands at the precise angle she'd calculated 20 years ago. As it spun through the air, Michael remembered the last full conversation they'd had, just before graduation. "Basketball won't last forever," she'd told him, her voice weaker, but her spirit as strong as ever. "But what you've learned, about angles, about problem solving, about yourself, that will stay with you long after your last game." "How do you know this won't be my peak?" he'd asked, worried about the future. "How can you be so sure I'll make it?" She'd handed him the folded paper then, making him promise not to open it until he was ready, until he truly understood. The ball was still in the air, but in Michael's mind, he was watching a different shot. The first perfect fadeaway he'd ever made, with Mrs. Thompson watching, her red pen scratching calculations in her notebook. "Some things," she'd said that day, "you have to believe before you can see them." The crowd held its breath. The ball reached its apex, and in that moment, suspended between past and present, between failure and glory, between student and teacher, Michael Jordan finally understood what Mrs. Thompson had known all along. This wasn't just about winning a game. This was about keeping a promise he'd made 20 years ago. not just to her, but to himself. The ball began its descent toward the basket, carrying with it 2 decades of lessons, calculations, and one geometry teacher's unwavering belief in a kid who'd been cut from his high school team. Phil Jackson was already rising from the bench. He knew what was about to happen. They all did. After all, Mrs. Thompson's calculations were never wrong. The ball dropped through the net with a soft swish. The crowd fell silent for a split second before erupting in a mixture of groans and cheers. Bulls, 85, Jazz, 83. 20 seconds left on the clock, but Michael wasn't thinking about the score. His eyes were fixed on Mrs. Thompson, who was now holding up the folded paper with trembling hands. The same paper she'd given him on graduation day, the one still sitting unopened in his old bedroom drawer back in North Carolina. The memory of that day rushed back to him as his teammates surrounded him in celebration. It had been hot that June afternoon in 1981. The graduation ceremony was over, and Michael had been looking for Mrs. Thompson among the crowd of proud parents and beaming teachers. He'd found her sitting alone in her classroom, room 234, where everything had started. "I wasn't sure you'd come by," she'd said, looking up from her desk. She was much thinner then, her once dark hair now completely gray. The treatments had taken their toll, but her eyes still held that same sparkle. "Are you kidding?" young Michael had replied. "I wouldn't be here without you." She'd smiled at that, reaching into her desk drawer. "I have something for you. But you have to make me a promise." The paper she'd pulled out was crisp and white then, folded into perfect triangles. Mathematical precision, as always. "Don't open this," she'd said, "until you understand what I've been trying to teach you all along." About geometry? She'd shaken her head. About life? Young Michael had taken the paper confused. "How will I know when that is?" "You'll know." She'd stood up slowly, supporting herself on the desk. "Because when that moment comes, you'll be ready to make the shot that matters most." "But I've made lots of important shots," he'd protested. "Game winners even." "This will be different," she'd said. "This shot won't just be about winning. It will be about everything we've worked for, everything we've fought through. And when that moment comes, you'll feel it in your soul." Now, standing on the court in Utah, Michael felt it. This was the moment she'd been talking about. The Jazz called timeout. As his teammates headed to the bench, Michael glanced back at Section 113. Mrs. Thompson was writing something new in her notebook, just like she used to during their morning sessions. Another memory surfaced. It was from one of their last practice sessions together, after he'd learned about her illness. He'd been angry that day, missing shots he usually made. "Why?" he'd demanded after another miss. "Why did you spend so much time helping me when you were sick? When you should have been resting?" She'd put down her notebook and looked at him with those piercing eyes. "Because, Mr. Jordan, some lessons are worth any sacrifice." "But why me?" "Because you weren't just learning basketball," she'd said. "You were learning how to turn failure into formula, disappointment into data, setbacks into solutions." She'd picked up her red pen. "And someday, you're going to teach that lesson to the world." The timeout was ending. Phil Jackson was drawing up the final defensive play, but Michael's mind was still in that high school gym. "One more thing," Mrs. Thompson had said that graduation day after giving him the letter. "When you do open this, remember that numbers don't just tell us where we are. They tell us where we're going." He hadn't understood what she meant then. But now, watching her in the stands, still taking notes after all these years, it was starting to make sense. John Stockton was bringing the ball up court. The Jazz needed 2 points to tie. 3 to win. Everyone in the arena knew they would try to get the ball to Karl Malone. Michael got into his defensive stance, but his thoughts were racing. What was in that letter? What had Mrs. Thompson known 20 years ago that he was only now beginning to understand? The shot clock ticked down. Stockton passed to Malone. Michael saw the play developing in slow motion, like one of Mrs. Thompson's geometry problems coming to life. "Basketball is just like life," she'd told him once. "The answer is always there. You just have to know where to look." As Malone turned to make his move, Michael suddenly knew what he had to do. Not just for the game, but for the promise he'd made in room 234 all those years ago. The same promise Mrs. Thompson had kept, through illness, through treatments, through 20 years of waiting for this exact moment. He moved toward Malone, calculating angles and trajectories just as she'd taught him. But this wasn't about mathematics anymore. This was about something much bigger. This was about completing the lesson that had started on that autumn day when a sophomore boy, crushed by failure, had wandered into a geometry classroom and found something far more valuable than a spot on the varsity team. The ball was in Malone's hands, Michael's muscles tensed, ready to move. In the stands, Mrs. Thompson closed her notebook and smiled. She knew what was coming next. After all, she'd predicted it 20 years ago. In that split second, before Michael made his move, time seemed to freeze. Karl Malone had the ball, but Michael wasn't seeing Malone anymore. He was seeing every morning practice, every geometry lesson, every calculation Mrs. Thompson had ever taught him, all leading to this moment. "Remember," her voice echoed in his memory, "every action has an equal and opposite reaction." "That's not just physics, Mr. Jordan. That's life." Michael's hand shot out, quick as lightning. The ball popped loose from Malone's grip, exactly as the equations had predicted it would. 20 years of mathematics, all for this one perfect steal. The crowd gasped. His teammates yelled. But Michael only heard Mrs. Thompson's voice from that last morning practice session, when she'd barely had enough strength to hold her notebook. "Promise me," she'd said, "that when your moment comes, you won't just make the shot. You'll understand why you're making it." Young Michael had nodded, not really understanding. "I promise." Now, as he dribbled down court with the final seconds ticking away, he finally got it. This wasn't just about winning a championship. This was about finishing a lesson that had started 2 decades ago in room 234. The Jazz defenders scrambled to get back. Brian Russell was right on his heels. The crowd was deafening, but in Michael's mind, he was back in that quiet gym at 5:55 a.m. with Mrs. Thompson's red pen scratching calculations in her notebook. "Life will push you," she'd told him, "just like defenders will push you. The secret isn't pushing back harder. It's about using their force to create your own space." Michael slowed his dribble near the top of the key. Russell was right there, just like Mrs. Thompson had predicted in one of their last sessions. "Someday," she'd said, "you'll face a defender who thinks they know what you're going to do. That's when you'll use everything you've learned. Not just the moves, but the reason behind the moves." The game clock showed 5.2 seconds. Michael crossed over to his right. Russell bit on the fake, just like the equations said he would. Basic geometry. A body in motion tends to stay in motion. 3 seconds. The slight push. The step back. The gather. Each movement precisely calculated, just as Mrs. Thompson had taught him. But this time, Michael wasn't thinking about angles or trajectories. Seconds. He was thinking about a geometry teacher who had seen past his failure. who had turned his biggest disappointment into his greatest strength, who had fought through illness and pain just to teach him lessons that went far beyond basketball. Seconds, as Michael rose for the shot, he looked toward section 113. Mrs. Thompson was standing now, that folded paper held tightly in her hands. Even from this distance, he could see tears in her eyes. Seconds. The ball left his fingers at exactly 37 degrees. Perfect arc. Perfect rotation. Perfect everything. Just like she'd drawn it up all those years ago. Time stopped. In that frozen moment, Michael suddenly understood what was written on that paper. He didn't need to open his copy back home. He knew. It wasn't just calculations. It wasn't just predictions about his future success. It was something much more important. The ball reached its apex. Mrs. Thompson had taught him that life, like geometry, was about finding the right angles, about turning obstacles into opportunities, about seeing patterns where others saw only problems. The ball began its descent. She had taught him that every failure was just a data point. Every setback was just a chance to recalculate. Every challenge was just a problem waiting for the right equation. The ball passed through the net with a soft swish. Game over. Bulls win, 87-83. His teammates rushed the court. Fans screamed and cried. Photographers' flashes lit up the arena like lightning. But Michael wasn't celebrating. Instead, he was running. Running past his teammates, past the reporters, past everyone. Running straight to section 113, row 22. Because he finally understood what Mrs. Thompson had been teaching him all along. It was never about the shot. It was never even about basketball. It was about believing in yourself enough to keep showing up day after day, even when the numbers said you couldn't make it. It was about turning disappointment into determination, defeat into data, and failure into formula. As he reached the stands, Mrs. Thompson stood waiting, tears streaming down her face, that same folded paper in her hands. "You finally understood," she said softly. Michael nodded, his own eyes filling with tears. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She smiled that familiar smile. "Because, Mr. Jordan, some lessons can't be taught. They have to be lived." Then she handed him the paper, the original one she'd written 20 years ago. It was time to read what she had known all along. With trembling hands, Michael unfolded the yellowed paper. The red ink was faded, but still clear. Mrs. Thompson's precise handwriting exactly as he remembered it. The first thing he saw was a date, October 15th, 1978. The day after he'd been cut from the varsity team. The day he'd first walked into room 234. Below it was a simple diagram, a basketball court drawn with perfect geometric precision. And there, marked in red, was the exact spot where he'd just made the championship-winning shot. But it was the words beneath that made his breath catch. "Today, a young man walked into my classroom, carrying the weight of failure on his shoulders. He doesn't know it yet, but this failure will become his greatest teacher. And 20 years from now, in the biggest game of his life, he will make a shot that proves what I already know, that failure is just the first step toward finding the right angle. The shot will come from the right side, just above the free throw line. The defender will lean left. Michael will step back. The ball will leave his hands at 37 degrees. And when it goes in, he will finally understand what I've been trying to teach him. That mathematics isn't just about numbers. That geometry isn't just about angles. That teaching isn't just about lessons. And that believing in someone isn't just about faith. It's about seeing the equations that others miss. I may not be there to see it happen. My doctors tell me that's unlikely. But I've done the calculations, and I know that some things are more certain than others. So I will keep teaching him for as long as I can. Not just about basketball, but about life. About turning setbacks into setups. About finding the perfect arc through any storm. And someday, when he makes this shot, he will teach these same lessons to the world. Because that's what this has always been about. Not just about winning a game, but about winning at life. With absolute mathematical certainty, Mrs. Sarah Thompson. Michael looked up from the paper, tears flowing freely now. Mrs. Thompson reached out and squeezed his hand. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You learned the most important equation of all." "Which one?" he asked, his voice breaking. She smiled that special smile one last time. That determination plus dedication, divided by doubt, multiplied by perseverance, always equals possibility. The arena was still roaring, cameras were flashing, his teammates were looking for him, but Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player in the world, stood quietly with his geometry teacher, understanding at last that his greatest victory hadn't just happened on the court. It had started 20 years ago in room 234 when a teacher had looked at a failed basketball player and seen a future champion, not just of the game, but of the spirit. After all, some calculations are about more than just numbers. They're about believing in what others can't see, until they're ready to see it for themselves. And there you have it. The untold story of how one teacher's belief changed basketball history forever. I'd love to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below, and let me know if you've ever had a teacher who believed in you when nobody else did. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button. And for another inspiring story about the teachers who shape our lives, click the video appearing on your screen right now. Remember, sometimes our biggest setbacks lead to our greatest comebacks. See you in the next story.